Okay, welcome. All right, this week we are starting our final play of the semester, and we're going to be talking about the first half of The Tempest. Um, and this video is going to sort of cover two big topics. The first topic we're going to talk about is the idea of dramatic genres during Shakespeare's day and how we categorize what were known as the problem plays like The Tempest. More on that in just a minute. And then the second big topic we're going to tackle today is The Tempest and colonialism. That's sort of one of the big theoretical frameworks that we use to talk about The Tempest. But first, let's talk about early modern dramatic genres, okay? So the early moderns, Shakespeare and his contemporaries, sort of inherited two major theatrical genres from the ancient Greeks and Romans, and those were tragedy and comedy. Now, if you remember from our discussions in Othello, each of these genres had conventions that sort of dictated what was supposed to happen in the play. So tragedies, if you remember, were supposed to be about noble figures, kings, princes, aristocracy, and they were supposed to explore so we have depressing endings, essentially. That is what makes it a tragedy. They explore themes of revenge, themes of justice, themes of madness, death, lots of death, oftentimes end in death. And sort of exploring how these characters do not have control of their lives. These characters are often at the whim of fate. And right, if you remember also with tragedy, the heroic figure, the protagonist, is supposed to be one that the audience identifies with, that noble figure. Comedies, on the other hand, were often about lower class, middle class or lower class characters. A subgenre was the pastoral comedy. This was about shepherds or country folk. And comedies, they were often funny and clever, but the defining characteristic of the comedy actually was that it usually ended with happy resolution, oftentimes with a marriage. Comedies did often explore tropes of young lovers fighting against parents who disagreed with their wishes. And the happy resolution was that the young couple was able to get married in the end. Although there were other types of comedies that didn't necessarily have to end with marriage. But again, defining feature was that they were about lower class people. Now, the early moderns started playing around with these two genres, all right? These are the ones they inherited from the Greeks. But they started playing around with them and creating their own genres, new genres, mixing and matching. And so, in fact, when Shakespeare's first folio is published in 1623, they decided to organize it into three dramatic categories. They started off with the comedies, then there were the tragedies, and then they created a category called the histories. And this included most of Shakespeare's works about kings, the kings of England, kings of and actual historical figures of the past. Most of those stories could also have been classified as tragedies. A few of them could have been classified as comedies as well, but they created this new dramatic genre in calling them histories. Subsequent editions of Shakespeare's works, however, editors and the people compiling those editions sort of noticed that many of Shakespeare's plays didn't seem to fit neatly in any of these categories. They weren't strictly tragedies. They weren't strictly comedies. In fact, they seem to combine elements of that. And these plays were often called the problem plays. Okay? And they included plays like The Tempest, Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, Pericles, Two Noble Kinsmen. There's a handful of others that are considered problem plays. And so there was lots of questions about where to put these plays. Now, the Tempest and the Winter's Tale in the first folio was put with the comedies, and they do end happily. They do end with resolution, and they do end with marriages. But they are about noble characters most of the time. The Winter's Tale actually does veer off into a little pastoral comedy, but they're not about the common everyday people. In fact, actually, some of other Shakespeare's, I mean, think of A Midsummer Night's Dream. They're pretty noble in that play as well. And also with The Tempest and with the Winter's Tale and with these ones, there's a lot of darkness before we get to that happy resolution. Often a lot of violence and a lot of depressing circumstances that are fairly heavy. So sometimes these plays are referred to as tragicomedies, where they're a mix of the tragic and the comedic. But another term that got introduced, actually, I think this one got introduced in around 1845, was romance. Okay, the genre of romance. Now, when we think of the genre of romance today, we have a sort of very specific genre in mind, a literary genre at least, or a cinematic genre, and sort of sums it up, right? So a story that is very romantic, definitely involves, love story of some sort, preferably a happy love story. Although, right, by today's standards, wouldn't we consider Romeo and Juliet to be a romance? Anyway, point being, this is not what romance meant in Shakespeare's day, nor what was meant when the term started being applied to these problem plays of Shakespeare's in the late 1800s. So, what is a romance? Let's do a little history into that term. Goes all the way back to Rome. Surprise, surprise, right? You've heard of the Romance languages, right? Those are French, Italian, and Spanish, and the handful of other spin-offs from Latin. Those are called the Romance languages that spun off of the Roman language, which was Latin. And so novels or books, okay, because novel wasn't necessarily a term then, but books, stories, poems, plays that were written in the Romance languages came to be known as romans, or romance texts. Now, early on, around Shakespeare's time, most of these stories had some defining characteristics. A lot of them did involve what was a genre that was also known as courtly love. And we're not going to get into courtly love because that is an entire medieval genre that deserves its own PowerPoint presentation. But it did involve noble aristocratic people. And yes, love was involved, but not the type of love. It was very often unconsummated love, more like love between a knight and his queen or something like that, right? Where we're not talking about consummated romantic relationships the way we think of them today. We're talking very different concept of love, basically. But they did involve noble characters. They often involved trials, and lots of adventures, and going through issues and battles and things like that. And then at the end, there may or may not be resolution. So when we apply the term romance to some of Shakespeare's plays, that's more of the tradition that people are referencing when they say that these are romance plays. So what is a Shakespearean romance then, or what are some of the characteristics of it? So Shakespeare romance plays, they will have violence, quite a bit of violence often, and often literal or metaphorical death. So characters will die in Shakespeare's romances, um, which is different than other comedies. Most of the time in comedies, you don't have characters die. Often there is a passage of time. In The Winter's Tale, for example, something like 20 years, there's something like 20 years that pass between Act 3 and Act 4, I think. There's actually not a great passage of time in The Tempest. The Tempest is one of Shakespeare's most unusual plays because if you remember when we talked about the unities, The Tempest actually obeys the unities of time and place. It all takes place on the island in the scope of one day. One of his rare plays to actually adhere to the unities. But his other romance plays often involve quite a bit of passage of time. There is intergenerational orientation, meaning parents and children. It's usually a story about parents and children. There's suffering and repentance, forgiveness and acceptance of human frailty, and then a final reconciliation. So they usually do end happily, even if there's been a lot of trial and struggle and tragedy to get there. And often these final resolutions, these final reconciliations, will have some bit of divine intervention or magical intervention to bring about that happy ending. So those endings can feel a little bit unrealistic, as the term we would use today. But those are definitions of the Shakespearean romance. Those are some of the key characteristics that kind of tie a bunch of these problem plays together that don't fit neatly in either tragedy or comedy. I don't love the term romance. I don't love applying the term romance to these plays, um, specifically for the reason that that is not the term Shakespeare would have used to describe them. It wasn't a generic term that they were using back then. I do think that tragic comedy is a little bit of a better term. I'm also fine, personally. This is Tanner's personal opinion here. I'm fine actually calling most of them comedies in general, just based on the happy endings. The fact that they end usually with reconciliation and with a marriage, I think it is absolutely 100% fine to go with those 1623 folio categorizations of these plays and put The Tempest and The Winter's Tale, at the very least, in the category of comedy. You may be wondering, well, why does it matter? Why does it matter at all? Clearly, they were playing around with genres and mixing up genres, and you know, it's true. It's true. Shakespeare was mixing and matching and not seeming to care about strict generic conventions. So, does it matter? Does it matter a whole lot what we call them? Yes and no, right? No, it doesn't matter in that clearly the fun of these plays is that Shakespeare was messing with generic conventions. He was mixing things up and he wasn't following strict rules, and that is fun. But if you remember from Othello, our discussion there, it can also matter quite a bit to understand why the characters are doing what they're doing, why what happens in the play is happening, when you remember that there are rules and conventions that the author is either following or choosing not to follow. It can help explain some things, right? So when we look at the endings of these plays, and it's like it seems miraculously happy or magically happy, and we critique it for that, we can stop and be like, well, that was the convention of the genre. So can you really be too upset about it? Okay, off my soapbox about genres and whether we should call The Tempest a comedy or a romance. I'll take either one in this class. Okay, let's switch gears now now and chat about the Tempest and colonialism, okay? This is super important. This is a big theme that we absolutely have to talk about because colonialism is probably the number one lens through which the Tempest is interpreted and talked about today, um, which is super, super interesting. Now, the main way that colonialism is brought into the Tempest is through looking at the character of Caliban. Caliban is a super interesting character, right? Um, we have a very, very vague description of him in the play. He is very derogatory terms are used to describe him. Monster is used to describe him. Here's what we know. Here's what I'm saying. Here's what we do know about Caliban. We know that he was born on the island. We know that his mother's was named Sycorax and that she was a witch, and we know that his mother came from Algiers. Um, we're also somewhat told that his father was probably a demon or some other spot. We actually don't know much about his father. But this little bit of information has given rise to a whole bunch of speculation about what Caliban actually is and what he looks like. Okay. Now this spans everything. This speculation spans the whole scope from, believing Caliban to be more of a demon-like figure himself. You see this portrayal over here. It's almost like the creature Golem from The Lord of the Rings. And not even giving Caliban any sort of humanity, right? Relying solely on this idea that his mother was a witch and his father was a demon, making him very non-human and strange, strangifying him that way. So the debates have raged from Caliban's even human status up to his racial status. Was he white? Was he black? What was he? So his mother coming from Algiers does not help us answer that question much, right? If you remember our discussion of Othello's race, and Othello was from Northern Africa, which is where Algiers is, Algeria, Northern Africa, which means there's the potential for Caliban to be black, but there's also the potential for him to be more of that Arabian, darker, or lighter, very light actually, even Caucasian, Muslim sort of ethnicity. And so you'll see Caliban played by white characters. You'll see Caliban played by black actors. You'll see him portrayed as a monster. You'll see him portrayed as a human. There's just such a range of interpretation available in what Caliban is and what he looks like. And that how he figures, how he's cast, really does play into how we can interpret Prospero and Miranda's treatment of him. So this is where sort of our colonialist discussion comes in. So let's take a closer look at some of the language from the play itself. And this is really, really tough colonialist language here. So let's take a look at it. So this is from Act 1, Scene 2. Caliban says, I must eat my dinner. This island's mine, by Sycorax my mother, which thou takest from me. When thou camest first, thou strokest me, and made much of me, wouldst give me water with berries in it, and teach me how to name the bigger light, and how the less, that burn by day and night. And then I loved thee, and showed thee all the qualities of the isle, the fresh springs, brine pits, barren place and fertile. Cursed be I that did so. All the charms of Sycorax, toads, beetles, bats, light on you, for I am all the subjects that you have, which first was mine own king, and here you stye me in this hard rock, while yous do keep me from the rest of the island. So Caliban's telling a story here that sounds awfully familiar to most European colonial activity. At first, the native population, which Caliban represents, even though his mother, Sycorax, isn't necessarily native to the island, Caliban himself is, right? So he represents a native population to the island. And at first, he welcomes Prospero and his daughter, and they teach him all of these amazing, wonderful things. And he loves that. He loves what they are able to teach him. He loves the knowledge he's able to get from them. And he shows them all the secrets of the island, shows them where to find food, where to find places to drink. And then guess what happens? Guess what those Europeans do? They enslave him, essentially. And he is kept to a small part of the island and is not allowed to roam. And then look at the way Prospero treats him. Thou most lying slave, whom stripes may move, not kindness. So Prospero beats Caliban. I have used thee, filth as thou art, with humane care, and lodged thee in mine own cell, till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child. Ooh, it gets muddy here. This is super muddy stuff, okay? Caliban. Oh ho, would it had been done, thou didst prevent me. I had peopled else this isle with Calibans. So, look, I am not going to try to justify Caliban's actions here in any way, because yes, he seems to confirm here that he had the intent to rape Miranda. And that's never okay. It's never a good thing. However, we can definitely have our debates about whether this action was one of desperation out of reaction to the treatment he receives at the hands of Prospero, if he was driven to that sort of depravity, or if it was his quote-unquote natural state. That's a thorny debate to have. But we do get this interesting rejoinder from Miranda right after, and this one slips into the role of language, which I love talking about how language works in Shakespeare's plays. But watch Miranda's language, abhorred slave. So they call him a slave. They treat him as a slave. They have enslaved him, which any print of goodness will not take. And they, again, right there, all they credit Caliban with is evilness, with depravity, with, he's a lying slave. Kindness does nothing for him. He's capable of all ill. Miranda, I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or other. When thou didst not, savage, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gabble like a thing most brutish, I endowed thy purposes with words that made them known. But thy vile race, though thou didst learn, had that in it which good natures could not abide to be with. Therefore wast thou deservedly confined into this rock, who hadst deserved more than a prison. Whew. Caliban, his response, you taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language. So, there's so much to break down here. This is a microcosm of colonialism right here. The European settlers, now Prospero and Miranda have their own sad sob story too, which we aren't going to get into here. But these European settlers come in and they take pity on the native savage who can't speak, who has no knowledge, and they teach him, right? They teach him all these things. Caliban says, "You taught me to name the bigger light and the less that burned both day and night." So teaching him about the sun, the moon, stars, days, knowledge, things like that. Miranda teaching him language. I taught you how to speak. I taught you these words. And thou didst did learn the language. He was capable of learning the language. But according to her, it did no good. Caliban said, "You taught me language, and the profit is that I now know how to curse you back." Use that language for cursing you. Wow, right? Should we talk about how English has been forced on such a wide majority of the world? And for that forcing our language on the world, the world now gets to soundly curse the English language culture. Right, lots of blame to go around here, lots of problematic behavior to go around here, and this is what people focus on when we talk about this play. We love to look at who the hero is, who the villain is, and in this text seems to indicate Caliban is our low-born, low-bred, savage character, but from our post-colonial perspective, there's grounds for pitying him, right? Okay, one more point to make about how colonialism is working here. There's an interesting passage in Act 2, which we're going to talk about in just a second, where Shakespeare is clearly referencing an essay written by Michel de Montaigne, who was a French essayist who lived during this time. Michel de Montaigne made the essay the genre that it is. He wrote a lot of famous essays. His collection's called Essays. And one of them was called On Cannibals. So he was writing about these new cultures that European explorers were going out and encountering. Now, Michel de Montaigne's account of, particularly in his essay, he particularly talks about a native Brazilian tribe. And he just has glowing things to say about them. He says they are a natural people. They know the land. They don't have falsehood among them. They don't have inequality. They don't have all of these ills that Europeans have. And so, by Montaigne's estimate, this tribe from Brazil is more noble than the warring, fighting, tricky, sneaky, lying Europeans who are taking over their land. Now, obviously, the essay has some problems. The idea of the noble savage has its issues, but Montaigne was very sympathetic to the native people's plight and very critical of European behavior when it came to colonialist activity. So the portion that Shakespeare quotes is from Act 2. The king and his brother and a couple of their servants are all hanging around in the forest. The king thinks his son is dead, so he's sort of grieving. And they're talking about this new island that they've come across, and what would you do if you were king here? Is sort of, I guess, the question. And so Gonzalo, who is one of the advisors to the king, and P.S., he is one of the nicer ones, he makes this speech that is very, very clearly drawn almost directly from Montaigne's essays, which were translated into English in 1603. So Shakespeare definitely had an opportunity to read them before writing this play. In a commonwealth, I would by contraries execute all things, for no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate. Letters should not be known, riches, poverty, and use of service, none. Okay, he's basically listing things that he would not have in his new commonwealth, which are the things that Montaigne maintains that this great Brazilian tribe practices. Um, but the other characters tend to make fun of him for it, right? Um, the latter end of his commonwealth forgets the beginning. That's actually not the funniest thing they say about it. But this is the second half. All things in common nature should produce, without sweat or endeavor, treason, felony, sword, pike, all its kind, all poison, all abundance to feed my innocent people. So Gonzalo is sort of imagining a utopia here, which again is problematic, a problematic way of viewing sort of native and indigenous cultures as utopias. But what's interesting, again, to consider a discussion of how colonialism is working in this play is this question of, is Shakespeare critiquing colonialism, or is he critiquing, is he following into a more traditional path of critiquing these lesser native indigenous people, right? So he gives this speech to Gonzalo, who is a positive character in the play, but the comments of Antonio and Sebastian and some of the others sort of poke holes and make fun of this sort of utopian ideal view of non-European civilizations. They point out all the problems to this idea of viewing these other cultures and these other worlds as utopias, which is, some fair criticism. So to summarize, all of this is to say is that this play is tricky, right? It's tricky and it's interesting to think about. I want you to be thinking about how colonialism is working, and this larger question of, is this invasion, this micro example of colonialism here on this island, where we have this invasion of Europeans into a space that was peopled by at least one native, which is why we call this a micro example. In the end, is this a critique of their presence and their treatment of the people of the island, or is it a critique of Caliban, whose name is an anagram for cannibal? Is it a critique of his savagery and of his demon-like nature? Is Shakespeare falling into those stereotypes, or is he complicating things? And there's possible answers on both sides, so let's keep that in mind as we keep reading through this play, through the rest of this play. And next week, of course, we'll return to my favorite themes of magic and language and dreams and all of that fun stuff that also goes on in this play. So we will see you back there then.